Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. I am Anne Scatlin, the Executive Director of the Sciences Po American Foundation. The Sciences Po American Foundation's mission is threefold. Expand the impact of Sciences Po and the Foundation's work by amplifying fundraising. Develop Sciences Po's network and heighten the awareness of Sciences Po in the US. Since its inception, a little bit over 10 years ago, plus COVID, the foundation has raised over 20 million. We supported Sciences Po's major project to transform its Parisian campus. Earlier this year, Sciences Po expanded its presence in Paris and opened the door to 1 Saint-Thomas. Just across Boulevard Saint-Germain, this new location gives Sciences Po, its students, its faculty, its alumni, there is actually a Maison de Sciences Po, a new site to learn, meet, discuss, and imagine the world. And if you haven't had the opportunity to go back to Paris and to visit the new site, please let me know, and I'm happy to organize a tour. We funded 75 scholarships and are launching this year the Sciences Po American Foundation Scholarship Fund. Every year, Sciences Po awards nearly $300,000 to US students to study at the Collège Universitaire and for their master's or in one of the Sciences Po 7 graduate schools. Sciences Po is home to over 400 seeking degree students from the US, and another 400 spend time on Sciences Po's campuses as an exchange student. Over the years, we supported 25 research and educational projects and are now launching the Sciences Po Transatlantic Research Fund with the ambition to provide Sciences Po researchers the leverage to initiate fruitful joint research with a US university that carries the potential to expand into larger projects. This project echoes the support of the McCourt Foundation, who committed to a $25 million gift to support the development of new scientific work conducted by Sciences Po, to fund annual or multi-year research projects on the topic related to tech for the common good. But our ambition at the Foundation is also to build a Sciences Po alumni network in the US. And I am thrilled tonight to be celebrating Jamison and our community and to host the US Sciences Po Alumni Award for the first time in Washington, D.C. Every year, the US Sciences Po Alumni Award is an opportunity to recognize and honor an outstanding individual who embodies the values that Sciences Po and our community strive to uphold. We launched the award in 2015 and have recognized alumni who are visionary leaders in each and their own way. Hubert Joly, the former president and CEO of Best Buy, Olivier François, the Chief Marketing Officer at Chrysler and head of the Fiat brand, Jérôme Péribert, the former president and CEO of Sealed Air, the Barber Wrap company. People probably don't know what Sealed Air is. Guillaume Giselle, the president of Tom Ford Beauty, Maël Gavet, the president of Techstar, Émilie Mazzucarati, the founder and CEO of 427, a Moody's affiliate since 2019 and a leading publisher and provider of data, market intelligence and analysis related to climate change. And last year to Mike Schmull, campaign manager for Pete for America, Pete Buttigieg's 2020 presidential campaign. In the US and across the globe, Sciences Po alumni are improving society around us, rethinking, inventing, pioneering. I am now letting the floor to Émilie de la Bruyère. Émilie is a co-founder of Horizon Advisory, a leading geopolitical consultancy and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense for Democracies. She's a recognized expert on China's technological and industrial ambition, the implication for global security, economics, and human rights, and in the role of transatlantic ties in contemporary and international competition. Émilie?
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm a Sciences Po alumna and a member of the Sciences Po American Foundation Board. And this evening, it's my enormous privilege to be here to honor Jamison Greer. At a time when assumptions about international trade and also norms on international trade are being turned on their heads, Jamison is a leading expert in the field. Perhaps more importantly, he's also a leading force in defining and deploying the new frameworks and tools for international trade the world desperately needs. At present, Jamison is a partner in the international trade team at King & Spalding, where he specializes in and is about as good as it gets in trade policy negotiations, trade agreement enforcement, export and import compliance, and all things CFIUS. Jamison has represented clients in trade remedy litigation before the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission, and federal courts. Before joining King & Spalding, Jameson served as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. At USTR, Jameson worked closely with Ambassador Lighthizer and White House officials on the White House's trade strategy, including, of course, landmark achievements like the Phase 1 trade deal with China and the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. Before working at USTR, Jameson spent several years in private practice focusing on trade-related matters and also served as the U.S. Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps. Jameson perfectly embodies Sciences Po's mission and also its definition of excellence. Analytically and intellectually, he marries rigor with creativity, an unmatched expertise in the international trade system as it currently exists, with a nuanced understanding of the challenges facing it and how those can be addressed. Jameson also works actively to face those down, to put his expertise to concrete use in advancing a better alternative. Take, for example, Jameson's role in the White House's negotiations on the Phase 1 trade deal with China. This was a watershed moment for U.S. and international approaches to trade relations among major powers. Sciences Po's mission is to train the leader and the practitioner, and to equip them not only with analytical rigor, but also the ability to bridge frameworks, whether those are intellectual or cultural. I can't think of anyone who embodies that ideal better than Jameson. And throughout, Jameson is unfailingly generous and kind. Professionally, intellectually, and personally, he is a role model for Sciences Po alumni, or at least for this one. It's a privilege to honor this year's recipient of the U.S. Sciences Po Alumni Award. Please join me in welcoming Jameson Greer.
Very generous. Thank you. Picture, right? I'm going to put this here. Well, thank you. Thank you, Anne and Emily, for that very warm and generous introduction. You might be regretting it a few minutes from now when I'm still talking. So I encourage you, since you're all standing, if you need to take a lap around, that's perfectly fine. But I'm really honored to receive this award. And, it's important for me, my experience at Sciences Po started in this building, in the French Embassy. I was working in a legal office in Delaware for the summer. And there was one open day when my wife and I, my wonderful wife who's right here, that we could come and get our student visas in order to go to France. And the one day we could come was July 13th, which is the day before July 14th, which is Bastille Day. So you would not be surprised to know that the French Embassy Consular Services Division closes early on the day before Bastille Day. But through sheer luck, or maybe something more deliberate than that, we were the last people to make it through the doors of the embassy on July 13th. And we had brought stacks of documentation, birth certificates, marriage certificates, bank statements, passports, everything, right? And in triplicate, because we know the French, right? But the document the official was the most interested in, and the one that actually kind of smoothed everything, was the letter from Sciences Po saying that they were inviting us to come to France. And so we went to France. And here I am today, again, having come full circle in the most surprising way possible. And since that time, I've had a lot of interesting experiences in the public sector, in the private sector. As you heard, my area of expertise is international trade law and policy. It's a topic that in the past few years, it's moved from mid-level discussions among technocrats really to high-profile negotiations, major trade disputes that are led by world leaders themselves. So that's a big change as to where we were maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And in fact, if you look at Russia's illegal war on Ukraine, it has now resulted in the most coordinated, rapid, and expansive trade realignment we've seen since perhaps World War II. And so tonight, I actually want to say a few words about this. I want to talk about how this economic breakup with Russia has actually been implemented. It might be a little boring and in the details, but I think it's important to understand it. It's not as monolithic as people think. I want to talk about what that means for relations between the US and the EU and other allies. And then I want to talk about what it means for the relationship between the West and China. So first, let's talk about this economic aspect of the Russian conflict. As you all probably know, you're all educated folks, you read the news. It's a coordinated effort among the United States, EU, UK, Canada, Japan, and many others to limit trade and investment with Russia in a staged and escalating way with the goal of reducing Putin's ability to prosecute the war. The hope is that the sanctions will prevent him from acquiring the equipment, know-how, financing, and other support he needs to continue his invasion. You will hear people identify other goals of the sanctions, and I agree that there are other goals, there are other effects, there are other outcomes. But I think the goal that I have just articulated is the fundamental goal of the sanctions, and it's the metric against which we should measure their effectiveness. But now I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the sanctions themselves. My experience is that those who are not steeped in international trade and economics hear the word sanctions and assume that all sanctions are the same, and more specifically, that these measures are tantamount to a trade embargo. But the landscape is a lot more nuanced than that, and it's important to understand this as we hopefully go into a new era where the US and the EU are cooperating on these kinds of things more frequently. So I'm speaking to US sanctions here in the Russia context, but when I say US sanctions, I want you to think EU sanctions, UK sanctions, other sanctions, because as I think you know, other jurisdictions in conjunction with the US, they have all done a similar set of sanctions on Russia, really led by the EU, I must add. And many of these measures also apply equally to Belarus, who is Russia's willing partner in this aggression. So first of all, we have comprehensive sanctions, right? And this is like the Crimea region of Ukraine, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic. These areas, these regions are subject to comprehensive sanctions, which constitute an effective trade embargo, right? So this means exactly what it sounds like. No imports or exports are allowed, no financial transactions are allowed, either directly or indirectly by US persons or UK persons or you name it. But the other sanctions in response to this war, they're more targeted. They're targeted to specific Russian individuals and entities and industrial sectors. In the United States, we have the Treasury Department that is our primary sanctions authority. And for this conflict, Treasury has designated as sanctions persons numerous oligarchs with close ties to the Russian government officials like the Duma, Russia's parliament, likewise certain Russian banks, oil and gas companies, aerospace and shipping companies, and companies with military ties have been specifically sanctioned. And again, this means that these individuals and entities, they can't transact with US persons through imports, exports, provision of services, financing, and other activities. And then Treasury has also designated certain sectors as target areas for sanctions, like the oil and gas industry, or business organization and management consulting services. And then, yet again, you have some entities are identified as sanctioned persons, but they're actually subject to really narrow limitations, like you can't buy their debt or their equity. And then, separately from all of that, we have what I call export controls, right? These are limits on actual goods, services, software, technology, and that kind of thing that can be exported to Russia regardless of who it might be going to, right? And this is a situation where you can't send it to just a normal person, they're not an oligarch, but that item is so sensitive. These are usually what we call dual-use items, right? Items that can be used for civil reasons or have military applications. It's often machinery, semiconductors, certain materials, aerospace parts and components, software, encryption, and the like. And right now, our Commerce Department, along with many sanctions authorities in the EU and the UK and elsewhere, they've imposed a rule saying you have to have authorization to send this stuff to Russia. And by the way, we're not going to approve those authorization requests. So that's what they're planning to do. So you can see that the term sanctions really covers an enormous area. So when you hear people talking about sanctions, you need to think about that. It's a very nuanced landscape. And as many in the audience may know, developing a multilateral sanctions program is exceptionally difficult. And one can look at the example of Iran to understand the difficulty. The West has really struggled to reach a common approach to sanctions on Iran. And frankly, Iran has benefited from that dissension within the West. It's played Western nations off one another. And so, we often see, and you probably recognize this, when it comes to economic responses to bad actors, there's a familiar pattern, right? Often the United States is really aggressive and wants to, go out there and take very strong measures. And then sometimes you have the EU and others who want to take a different, more conciliatory approach. And I'm not making a judgment point here. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong. I just make the point that it is very difficult to coordinate on multilateral sanctions. So it's remarkable to me that the United States, the EU, the UK, and all the others have managed to align and implement such a stunning array of sanctions in such a short period. It is remarkable enough that it merits some discussion. So really, what does this tell us about the relationship between the EU and the US at this time? At a minimum, this cooperation, it tells me that Western nations are capable of responding in concert in a coordinated way to a perceived threat to shared core national interests. So it's critical that in coordinating these economic responses, that these core interests are well identified and that the costs are well understood, because it can differ, right? It's important to acknowledge the threat level differs between the US and the EU with respect to the Russian conflict, and the cost differs too. For example, two-way trade between the EU and Russia is about $250 billion a year, okay? Germany is the largest trading partner in goods in both exports and imports with respect to Russia. This is clearly a very substantial amount and includes, importantly, energy trade, including energy that warms European households during the winter. But the very real presence of armed conflict in Europe and the tanks rolling in the eastern plains, these pose a tangible physical threat to European security unseen since World War II. And as a result, the EU is balancing the substantial cost of a sanctions program with the imperative to degrade Putin's ability to wage a war that might not end in Ukraine. And I think the Europeans should be commended for taking these efforts despite the costs. On the US side, it's a different calculation. Two-way trade in goods with Russia was only about $36 billion two ways in 2021, a much lower amount compared to Europe. Further, the direct national security risk to the United States from the war is much lower compared to the risk to Europe. It's in your backyard. The net result is that the US can implement the same sanctions on Russia as Europe, but at a much lower cost and with less disruption to our economy. That's not to say there is no cost. I know from my own experience of the past 3 months, every day, talking to US companies who are dealing with this, there are certain sectors and businesses in the United States that have particular exposure and are suffering enormous losses due to their compliance, their willing compliance, I would say, with these sanctions programs. But at a minimum, we now know that the United States and the EU can come together in a powerful and coordinated way to implement economic and diplomatic pressure. Unfortunately, it looks like it took a kinetic war to drive this outcome. And my hope is that the United States and the EU can work together in a similar way to deal with other global challenges, including in situations short of war, that we can take these kinds of actions beforehand. Indeed, there are some challenges that pose an existential threat to national sovereignty, international order, and universal human rights. And I'm talking about the challenge of China as governed by the Chinese Communist Party and its chairman, Xi Jinping. So that brings me to my third and final point, which I'm sure you're all grateful for. It's the longest point, though, so I'm really sorry. What does EU and US cooperation on the Russia matter? What does that mean for how the West can address the challenge posed by China? Like in the Russian context, Western states must first decide on whether they agree that China, as governed by the CCP, is a threat to liberal values and democracy. And if so, to what extent it is a threat, and finally, what to do about it. In the United States, the position on the threat posed by China, and I want to be clear, when I say China, I'm talking about the CCP, okay? I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not talking about the Chinese population that is innovative and wonderful and does amazing things and has shown themselves to be incredibly resilient. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the CCP. The US position on the CCP has become clearer and sharpened over the past few years. Let me just read this quote to you from the 2017 National Security Strategy issued under the Trump administration. Here's what it says. And in your head, as I'm saying this, think to yourself, ask yourself if you agree with it or not. And then afterwards, you can come tell me if you agree or not, okay? And then I'll convince you. Here's what it says. For decades, US policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise and for its integration into the post-war international order would liberalize China. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. China gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale and spreads features of its authoritarian system, including corruption and the use of surveillance. It is building the most capable and well-funded military in the world after our own. Its nuclear arsenal is growing and diversifying. Part of China's military modernization and economic expansion is due to its access to the US innovation economy, including America's world-class universities. So that was from 2017. I must also note that through its unfair trading practices, subsidies, industrial overcapacity, forced technology transfer, high tariff and non-tariff barriers, and economic coercion, China has expanded its own industrial base at the expense of businesses and workers in the United States and also in the EU. It has used its market access from World Trade Organization membership to send subsidized goods all over the world and undermine its competitors, while largely keeping its own markets closed or difficult to access on a fair and equitable basis. And now, unfortunately, we can add to that list the knowledge that China is pursuing a sort of genocide in Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur population is being cleansed, oppressed, and subjugated through forced dislocation, re-education and concentration and labor camps, destruction of religious and cultural sites, and the tearing apart of Uyghur families. And that perhaps is the most damaging thing of all. You know, an historic building is ultimately just a building, but a family is something that should be sacred. The Trump administration's response to these malign activities was to impose costs on the CCP. And here are the different ways. By implementing tariffs that make subsidized Chinese goods more expensive to import. By enforcing laws that prohibit trade in goods made by forced labor. By strengthening scrutiny of Chinese investment in critical technology, critical infrastructure, and data-driven companies. By expanding export controls that limit the ability of the Chinese military-civil complex to grow and develop. By increasing investigation and prosecution of intellectual property theft and many other means. What is notable is that this approach has largely continued under the Biden administration. I think you all, that's fine. I think you all know that the Biden administration and the Trump administration differ on pretty much almost everything, right? In major ways, I must add. But on trade issues, and on China issues in particular, there has been remarkable continuity. Congress is generally unified on this as well, another kind of amazing thing. The tariffs remain in place, investment scrutiny and export controls continue, and there is a continued attention to IP and trade secret theft by our Department of Justice. Now, none of this is easy or cost-free, right? We started talking about there's a cost to a sanctions program. The U.S.-China economic relationship in terms of two-way trade was over $650 billion in 2021. This is orders of magnitude higher than U.S.-Russia trade, and it's more than double EU-Russia trade. I will say that the EU's view on China seems a little less clear to me. Again, there are different costs, different stakes. Last year, we had one European official criticizing U.S. efforts, stating that where the U.S. seeks confrontation with China, the EU seeks engagement. I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment or that summary of the situation, but I'm a little troubled by European official attempting to distance the EU from the U.S. and suggest closer ties with China. So whatever was meant by that statement, the perception was unsettling on this side of the Atlantic. But that's only one statement, right? We've seen a lot of important changes in the European discourse on China. The EU imposed sanctions in response to genocide in Xinjiang province. The French government refers to China now as a systemic rival. And despite heavy investment by German companies in China, we have recently seen German officials take issue with abuses in Xinjiang province. And we have heard German defense officials unequivocally declare that they are not somewhere in the middle, but are and will continue to be part of the West. Nonetheless, the messages have been mixed, and certainly we're guilty of that too on this side of the Atlantic from time to time. I think a worry on the U.S. side, particularly with some of our companies, is that as those companies, encouraged by the U.S. government, are seeking to diversify reliance on China, move their supply chains and go other places, there's a concern that European companies may take advantage of that movement to improve their own position in China, while the U.S. deals with the China issue alone and bears the costs alone. China, in turn, would feel much less pressure to change its behavior. It would continue to have considerable access to Western technology, to Western capital and trading markets. To me, this would be as if the U.S. left the EU to deal with the Russian aggression on its own, an outcome that seems unthinkable and absurd now. But the Russian experience also suggests that it is very possible that there could be true transatlantic support for sanctions or trade measures that inhibit the Chinese Communist Party's ability to unlawfully expand its borders, illegally obtain Western technology, unfairly compete in international trade, and systemically oppress people in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. I will just say, I think it will be really difficult for the West to maintain its values while also maintaining robust economic relations with China as governed by the CCP. I think that's a hard balance to achieve. And it's not a question of picking sides, right? I hear people say that, well, we don't want to pick sides. It's not a question of picking sides, it's a question of picking values, right? What values are you going to pick? And also companies, and I think governments need to do this, US government, other governments, companies are looking for clear signals from governments as to what the policy toward China will be with respect to economic matters. And ideally, this is something that the US, Europe, and others should do together and articulate clearly. I'm hopeful that efforts like the EU, US, Trade and Technology Council, or the TTC, will support transatlantic coordination on issues like export controls and investment scrutiny. It'd be really disappointing if the TTC devolved into just talking, when really it could be a forum for concrete action on Chinese abuses. And I'm hopeful that the clarity of purpose that drove Europe to take action in the Russia context takes hold in the China context too. I can go on, but I'll stop and spare you. But before I conclude, I do want, just please indulge me, I want to finish with one more story about Sciences Po. I mentioned that my wife, Marlo, and I, we moved to Paris together. And the most important part of our story is that Marlo gave birth to our first child when we were living there. We named her Noelle. She was born around Christmas. And after a few weeks, Marlo brought Noelle to Sciences Po to visit with my classmates. And we were in the courtyard at the building on the Rue des Saint-Père. And we took this baby and we passed this baby around to our classmates. And I think we were all really surprised that we, as university students, were allowed to be holding this baby and, in fact, were responsible for its well-being. But here, 15 years later, Noelle is, she's turning out wonderfully. And I see my classmates and other Sciences Po graduates around the world in charge of things, running companies, providing public service, conducting important research, and leading governments. And to me, it's a little bit like holding that baby. We have these fragile, really important things in our hands. And sometimes I look around, I'm a little surprised that they actually entrusted these things to us. And ultimately, it's just people, right, running our institutions. But I'm always happy to see it when it's Sciences Po people. People who I know have been trained to leave the world a better place than they found it. So thank you so much for this award, for your friendship and your trust. Thank you.